Hi, and welcome back to my channel, Quest for Faith with Brian. And today we're finishing up my three-part series on the early history of the Bible. So, just to kind of recap everything we've talked about, I started off with talking about kind of my journey to discovering the history of the Bible, with Martin Luther's main points about why he didn't think that the canonical books were canon, and how I disagreed with that. We kind of walked through what the view of Scripture was during Jesus's time, and talking about when the Jewish faith actually canonized their solidified their canon, and then we dove into the First Council of Rome, which was in 383 AD. In the second video, talking about Pope Saint Damasus the First and all the craziness going on with that one. And then we just touched on what they talked about on their council and what came out of it. So, and what came out of that was Jerome translating creating the translation, the Vulgate. Uh, and we talked a little bit about Jerome in that one too. But this one, we're going to talk about the last two, not the last two that ever talked about canon, but the last two of the early church, um, that are pretty significant councils. So the Council of Hippo and the Council of Carthage. Um, which Hippo and Carthage are really close together in South Africa. So we're going to talk about both of those and who are the main players in that. And then I'm going to touch on this a little bit, but I'm also going to put a link in to a video that if you really want to dive deeper into this, I definitely recommend it. But why, when I hear Protestants claim that Jerome is their key reason why they don't think those are apocryphal? Um, Gary Michuta on Apocalypse Apocrypha um did a great like 45-minute video on this, pulling sources and stuff. And I'm kind of going to quickly review that, but that's at the end. So hope you if you guys like this type of content, please like, share, and subscribe. And yeah, let's dive into it because it's been too long since I've last touched on this. So like I always said in these, I like talking about the who's who of what. And one of the main characters in this story is definitely Saint Augustine of Hippo. He was a doctor of the church. Before he converted to Christianity, he taught rhetoric and philosophy in Milan. He converted to Christianity in 387, was ordained a priest in 391, became bishop of Hippo in 395, and he was bishop until he died in 430. He had a massive impact on Christianity at the time. He wrote about the doctrine of original sin, grace, and free will. And also, he was one of the first to synthesize Christianity theology with Plato theology, right? So he was kind of the precursor to um, Aquinas. So he was the first doctor of the church to kind of start doing that. Especially, I mean, if he was teaching rhetoric in philosophy before, it would make a lot of sense that he would do that. So he was a big dude. Um, wrote prolifically. Tons of writings out there with him. So he was a big guy. One of the next ones, not as well known, but Bishop uh, Aurelius of Carthage. I think that's how you say his name. Um, he was ordained a bishop in 391. We don't know as much about him. We do know that he and Augustine were friends. But I mean, obviously, their bishopships weren't that far apart. They're both in North Africa. But he was known for church reform and discipline, pushing forth being more solidified with celibacy of clergy. Spent most of his time as bishop fighting the Donatist schism, and canon law, and also the biblical canon. So that's kind of the quick rundown of the two main characters for these two councils. Um, and so the first one we're going to look at, we're going to just go chronological order, is the Council of Hippo in 393. So this happened in modern day Algeria, but back then it was obviously a Roman province. Saint Augusta was there. They were talking about ecclesiastical issues. They were confirming what the Council of Rome had said about biblical canon, and dealing with church discipline and doctrinal matters also. So there's a lot of things that were going on. This wasn't just, I think how it's talked about a lot of times is that this council was solely both of these were just called just to review the biblical canon, but that's not, no, they had a lot more going on than just that. And so what they talk about, and obviously for the purpose of this video, we're going to kind of hit the first thing first, the Old Testament. Literally same books of the Bible that the Council of Rome said were the canon, including the 7 books that is not in the Protestant Bible: Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, First and Second Maccabees, Baruch, and the parts of Ezra and Daniel that are taken out there. And then also the 27 books that were universally accepted at this point. I think, like I said in my other video, even 30, 40 years before that, there was still a lot of argument over one of the, I think, Peter, Revelations, and a few other New Testament books that were still kind of being debated. But by this point, I think you can see with all these councils, there was really kind of a nope. This is the canon of Scripture that we believe is. And one of the things that this council said that only these approved scriptures could be read in mass. So if it was a book that was not, say, First Clement or one of the letters of Saint Ignatius of Antioch, you couldn't read that in mass. You could only read from the 46 books of the Old Testament and 27 books of the New Testament that were listed on there. So that was kind of putting the foot to the fire a little bit more, right? And so I think that's definitely something we hadn't seen before with that type of pronunciation there for a council. And again, this is a regional council. This isn't an ecumenical council. This isn't all of the bishops of Rome, including the Pope. This is just the Council of Hippo. So, but they also were settling matters on procedures and how to reinforce clerical celibacy and what to do if a bishop or a priest did have children. So the council also talked about ordination rules, that if a bishop was going to be ordained, if a priest was going to be ordained a bishop, it said that there had to be a minimum of 3 bishops present, up to 15 preferably, to ordain another bishop. And so they were kind of trying to put in more regulation around who could be ordained and the process behind that. And it also kind of seemed that they recognized Rome, as the Bishop of Rome, as being what we would consider the Pope today, because it does mention in the writings that they were going to send their decisions to the church across the sea for approval, indicating that's that kind of early census. And if you remember what I talked about with Pope Saint Damasus I, he was Pope during this time. No, he wasn't. He had died. I think he died in 384. But he had laid a lot of that groundwork down about giving Rome the center of Christianity at that point, and done a lot of work around defending the faith all across the Roman Empire. And so you kind of see that start formalizing in this. So that's the Council of Hippo. That's a really brief general overview. And again, like I always say, y'all, do your own research, look this stuff up yourself. Okay. If I got something wrong, throw it in the comments down below. But this is always considered a pretty impactful council when we're talking about the canon of scripture. Um, so let's dive into the next one, the Council of Carthage in 397. So obviously, this is 5 years, 4 or 5 years later. And this is in modern day Tunisia in North Africa. And Bishop Aurelius and Bishop Saint Augusta of Hippo are both present at this council. The main thing that they were fighting in this one, like I said earlier, was Donatism, schism. And this schism, I kind of want to talk about it because I really think it kind of it speaks to what's happening today in the church, right? Um, And this is where we start seeing the church kind of define this. This schism was basically saying that if a priest or bishop was not 100% perfect, that their sacraments did not count. So they had mass and they consecrated the host because they weren't a perfect bishop. Say they were sinful, and in whatever way that they decided were sinful, then it didn't count. Your baptism wouldn't be valid. Your marriage wouldn't be valid. And so you had this group of individuals that were, it got bloody and violent, once again. And they were coming in talking about that. And these councils were adamantly opposing this, saying no, the sacraments are from God. They're not done by the priest. Yes, they perform them in their office, but through the power of Jesus Christ is how these sacraments have validity, not through the power of the bishop. Um, and so that's kind of where you see this doctrine start formulating, was because of this schism. And I've heard arguments with this before, especially with the sex abuse scandal and other things going on in the church today, that it's like, well, how could those how could the sacraments even be valid by these disgusting priests? Because they're not, the miracles there with the sacraments is not done by the priest. It's done by Christ and God. So, but anyways, this is where that starts coming in. And so let's kind of dive into it. So same thing. They they for the Old Testament canon, which obviously is what this video is mainly about, is they came in and they said, "Yep, here are the books: Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, First and Second Maccabees, and then also adding Esther and Daniel, almost the exact same list." It's kind of interesting because Wisdom and Sirach are named slightly different every now and then. Um, uh Baruch is sometimes added into Jeremiah. Like there's some different things here that you have to actually understand what they're talking about to get. But yeah, it's the same. Some of the other things they were talking about with church regulation, um with issues of canon rules on clergy conducting baptism, reconciliation of heretics, right? So those that broke off and then have joined, have repented and received back into the church. How do you do that? And this was kind of interesting. For example, if ruled against they ruled against the rebaptism of those baptized by the schismatic group like the Dominus, emphasizing the validity of the sacraments regardless of the minister's status. Um, and I think that's kind of interesting with when you're talking about, I know as Catholics, it's preferable that the priest perform your baptism, right? That's what you should do. But as a baptized, confirmed Catholic, you can also perform the baptism in dire straits, right? Like if you're in a situation where you're not going to get a priest, you could actually baptize and it would still be valid as long as you do the Trinitarian baptism. So yeah, so they had a lot going on here. They also uh They also were discussing things how priests should be punished, and how bishops should be ordained, kind of the same topics they were talking about in Hippo. So these were pretty robust councils. They weren't just over one topic. There was a lot going on in the church at the time. A lot of things to address and iron out to make sure everybody was on the same page for both of these councils and for the Council of Rome. And I think I had pointed out on my last video that um, I think it was Wesley Huff had said, like, if you really read these, they weren't really being authoritative the way we think about it today. And I don't even know how you get to that conclusion if you've even skimmed what is written about or the documents we do have from these councils. Like, they're definitely being authoritative. This is not a wishy-washy, this is how you probably should act if you want to. It's none of that. It's pretty authoritative. So, again, these were important councils. They help kind of solidify the um, the canons of scripture for all of Christendom. And this kind of laid the groundwork for Pope Saint Innocent the first to send out a papal letter declaring these books as the books of the Bible. So, with all that being said, with those overviews, let's talk Saint Jerome. So I already kind of went over Jerome's life that he, after the Council of Rome and Pope Saint Damasus the First died in 384, um, he made his way down to Bethlehem, and that's where he lived for the rest of. Excuse me, y'all. That's where he lived for the rest of his life, and it was there, which is absolutely crazy that it was there at that point. He was translating the Bible in the cave where Jesus was born, which I find just absolutely fascinating. And it is true that in his prefaces before a few or for um before the canonical books, he did write, I'm not sure if these are scripture, um because you got to think at the time, this was pre 400, right? When he was writing those translations, they were getting sent out, right? And he was working with Jewish leaders and rabbis to get. He was going back and finding the Jewish texts to be able to translate the scriptures correctly into Latin, because there were so many bad translations out there at this point. He was trying to go back as best he could to the source, and at the time, I think the Jewish leaders were saying, "Yeah, we don't consider those scripture." But I remember, if you remember my first video, the Jewish leaders that Jerome was dealing with had just recently finalized their canon, right? And so I think Jerome came around later, and especially I think by 414 when we're looking at this, what I'm going to talk about here. And again, if you guys want to watch this video, yeah, it'll be up here in the top corner, um by um Gary Michuta. He does a way better job breaking this down. But essentially, you kind of see Jerome later on in life pointing out and seeming to agree that the deuterocanonical books are scripture. In letter 130, and this was written in 414, it says, "I think therefore that I ought to warn you in all kindness and affection to hold fast to the faith of Saint Innocent." The faith of Saint Innocent, which was Pope Saint Innocent, the spiritual son of Anastas and his successor in the apostolate seed, and not to receive any foreign doctrine, however wise and discerning you may take yourself to be. And so he's saying Pope Saint Innocent. That's why it says the apostolate seed. That's Rome. Um, Follow his teachings, follow his faith. He's the one that declared in 405 that these are the scriptures. And it's kind of interesting he says that, right? And then we got 2 years later where Jerome is writing this scripture, this dialogue against the Pelagians. And in this dialogue, he talks about Ecclesiastes, he talks about wisdom and Sirach. He names them as scripture in his writings there. And so for me, when I'm looking at this, and I think I agree with Gary on this, I mean, it's not 100%, right? We don't have um, St. Jerome later on in life writing, this is the canon of scripture that I believe. But it would seem to suggest that St. Jerome did submit to the church and say, no, yeah, these are canon by his writings later on in life. So 3 years before he died, he's quoting those deuterocanonical books as scripture. And so it kind of leads me to believe that I think Jerome had changed his mind later on in life. So again, check out the link below if you want to deep dive into Jerome and why Gary makes a pretty good case of that on why he thinks that Jerome changed his mind, and I happen to agree with him on that. But yeah, I hope this was interesting. I probably sorry it's taking me so long to do all three of these videos. Life gets in the way. But please like, share, subscribe, comment down below if you guys think I missed anything, or any other video ideas you guys want me to tackle. I really do appreciate it. Y'all have a great one. Talk to y'all later.